She wasn't invited, but she stayed and fighted. In 1883, when Wade Mercer returned after more than 2 years on the run herding cattle, he braced himself for a dilapidated and confiscated farm. Instead, he found lush green pastures, fat cattle, a new fence, and a strange woman pointing a gun at his face. Eleanor Hart was unwelcome in this town. People laughed at her, shunned her, treated her as if she didn't belong there. But she did what no one dared to do. She fought for a place that wasn't hers, and made it worth fighting for. Comment the name of the city you're viewing so I know how far this story has come. And don't leave, because the best is yet to come. The summer of 1883 came to the Mercer Ranch like a slow fever, the kind that doesn't kill you all at once, but wears you down over weeks until you're not sure which is worse, the sickness or the waiting. Wade Mercer didn't know any of that when he finally turned his horse off the main road and onto the long, rutted path that cut through the lower pasture. He'd been riding since before sunrise, pushing the animal harder than was fair, and the gelding's sides were dark with sweat and heaving like a bellows. Wade didn't ease up. He'd been waiting 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days to see that house again, and he wasn't going to slow down for the last half mile. He smelled the ranch before he saw it. That was the first thing that caught him off guard. Cattle. Not the stale ghost smell of an abandoned property, not the dry rot and dust he'd been bracing for, but the actual, present, lived-in odor of living animals and churned earth and hay cut not long ago. He pulled the gelding back to a walk without quite deciding to. His hand moved on its own. Then the house came into view around the tree line. He stopped. The porch boards had been replaced. All of them, by the look of it, the new wood still pale against the weathered frame. The south fence along the kitchen garden had been restrung with fresh wire. The barn door, which had been hanging off one hinge when he left, was standing upright and latched. There was a woodpile stacked against the side of the house that was bigger than anything he or his father had managed in a season, and there was a woman standing on the porch with a shotgun leveled at his chest. She was broad-shouldered and solid, wearing a faded work dress that had seen hard use, with her dark hair pulled back in a knot that had mostly come undone from a day of labor. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were steady. She was not, by any reading of the situation, afraid of him. "That's close enough," she said. Her voice carried well. She wasn't shouting. Wade raised both hands slowly, which was harder than it should have been because his whole body had gone stiff with something he couldn't name yet. Surprise, probably, or the particular confusion of a man who thought he understood what he was riding into and has been proven wrong before he even got off his horse. "This is the Mercer place," he said. "I know whose place it is." "Then you know I'm the one who ought to be pointing a gun at somebody." The woman's eyes moved over him without hurry, taking in the trail dust and the worn-down boots and the week's worth of beard, and whatever conclusion she drew from all of it, it didn't make her lower the gun. "You got a name?" she asked. "Wade Mercer." Something shifted in her expression. Not relief, not exactly. More like a person who'd been waiting for a particular conversation and wasn't sure they were ready for it now that it had arrived. "You have any proof of that?" He almost laughed. Almost. "Lady, I've got a scar on the inside of my left forearm from where a bull got me when I was 12 years old. And if you go inside that house and look at the top shelf in the back room, you'll find a tin box with my father's name on it and a photograph of me at about 9 years old standing next to a horse I hated. You want more proof than that? I don't know what to tell you." The shotgun didn't move for a long moment. Then slowly she lowered it, though she kept her hand on the stock, which Wade noted. "Eleanor Hart," she said, not like she was introducing herself to a friend, like she was establishing terms. "Miss Hart?" He kept his hands where she could see them and nudged the gelding forward another step. "You want to tell me what you're doing on my property?" "Saving it," she said, though I'm starting to wonder if it was worth the trouble. He didn't unsaddle the horse until she'd told him enough of the story to understand the shape of it, and even then he didn't fully believe it. Not because she seemed dishonest. She had the blunt, undecorated way of speaking that people develop when they've spent a long time not having anyone to perform for, but because the thing she was describing was almost too much to take in at once. She'd arrived in Alderman's Crossing 8 months ago on the southbound stage, carrying one trunk and a smaller bag, and a letter of introduction from a cousin in Abilene who'd since moved on to God knows where. She'd had a small amount of money and no connections, and had been looking, as she put it, for work she could do without someone deciding her appearance was a professional liability. "I used to work accounts for a dry goods merchant back in Missouri," she said. They were sitting at the kitchen table by then, Wade's hat on the floor beside him, a pot of coffee Eleanor had put on without asking whether he wanted any. "He let me go when his son came back from St. Louis with a bookkeeping certificate. The son couldn't add a column of figures without losing count, but he looked right, so." She said it without bitterness, which somehow made it worse. Wade wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. It was better coffee than he'd had in 2 years. "And the ranch?" "I was working at the hotel in town. Laundry, mostly, some cooking, enough to keep a room." She paused, looking at the surface of the table like she was deciding how much of this to tell. "I heard your foreman, Barlow, the one who was managing the place while you were gone, I heard him talking at the saloon one night. He wasn't quiet about it. The property was 3 months behind on the land note. The cattle were down to about 40 head from sickness, and he was planning to leave before the bank sent anyone out. He didn't want to be the one standing there when it happened." "Barlow," Wade said. He said the name like he was biting down on something he'd like to spit out. "He left 4 days after I heard him talking, just gone one morning." Eleanor turned her cup in her hands. "I came out here the next day. I don't entirely know why. I told myself I was going to see what shape it was in. Maybe talk to the bank myself and ask about the note. I wasn't planning to stay." "But you did." "The cattle were sick and scattered, and there were 2 calves that were going to die before the week was out if nobody did anything. And I—" She stopped, looked at her hands. "I knew what to do. I'd grown up on a farm. I knew what to do, and there was nobody doing it, so—" Wade was quiet for a moment. "You stayed 8 months." "I stayed 8 months." "Alone?" "Mostly." She glanced up at him. "I hired a hand named Dillard when I could afford it. He's still here, sleeps in the bunk room. He's reliable, quiet. Doesn't ask many questions, which was useful because I didn't have easy answers." Wade got up and walked to the window. The pasture out back had been reseeded. He could tell from the different shade of the grass, younger and thicker than what he remembered. Something coiled in his chest that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite shame, but lived somewhere between the two. "The land note," he said, "paid current. I sold 12 head in the spring at fair market, better than fair. I drove a harder bargain than Barlow would have. There's a ledger on the shelf with everything written down, every dollar in and out since I took over. You can check it against anything you want." He turned back to look at her. "Why?" She met his eyes without flinching. "Because I knew you'd want to." "I mean, why'd you do any of it? You didn't know me. You didn't owe me anything. This wasn't your fight." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, and when she answered, she chose her words carefully. "I didn't have anywhere to go," she said. "That's the honest answer. Alderman's Crossing had made it pretty plain I wasn't going to find a decent foothold there. I needed somewhere to be useful, and this place needed someone to be useful in it. That's all it was, at the start." "And now?" She looked around the kitchen. At the walls she'd probably patched, and the floor she'd probably scrubbed, and the window that had new glass in it that hadn't been there when he left. "Now I'd like to keep my room in the bunkhouse," she said, "until we work out what happens next." He thought about it for probably 3 seconds. "All right," he said. The thing about coming home to a place that's been running without you is that the knowledge of it has to arrange itself slowly. It doesn't land all at once. Wade spent his first week back walking the property from edge to edge, and every time he turned a corner, he found something he hadn't expected. A repaired gate, a cleared drainage ditch, a section of fence that had been redug and set more square than his father had ever managed. Small things, accumulated evidence of someone paying attention. Eleanor didn't follow him around and explain. She let him look. She had her own work to do and did it, and in the evenings she was at the kitchen table with the ledger, working through the week's accounts with a kind of focused quiet that reminded him of someone who'd learned a long time ago not to need company. Dillard, the hand she'd hired, was a lean man of about 50 with a sun-scored face and the manner of someone who'd worked a dozen different ranches and had opinions about all of them. He'd been a little wary of Wade at first, the wariness of a man who didn't know yet if the new situation was going to work out. But on the third evening, he came and found Wade in the barn while Wade was going over the tack. "She no horses," Dillard said without preamble. He nodded toward the house. "So I'm gathering. No cattle, too. Better than most men I've worked for. Doesn't show off about it." He picked up a bridle and looked at it, turning it in his hands. "First week she was here, before she could afford to hire anybody, she was out till past dark every day working those sick calves. Lost sleep over it." He paused. "Lost 2 of them, but she saved the other 6. That's a better number than they deserved." "I know. People in town talk about her." Dillard set the bridle down. "I've heard some of it. It's ugly." Wade kept his eyes on the leather he was oiling. "I figured. She doesn't say anything about it. Doesn't complain. Just keeps doing the work." "I know, Dillard." The older man looked at him for a moment. "Just making sure you do," he said, and went back to the bunkhouse. Walton. Wade went into Alderman's Crossing on his 6th day back, alone, to settle some business at the bank and pick up supplies. He hadn't told Eleanor he was going into town, hadn't told her what he was likely to hear. He heard it anyway. The man at the feed store, a red-faced fellow named Granger who'd been running the place since before Wade was born, was happy to fill him in. "Heard you were back," Granger said, loading sacks of grain onto the counter with more enthusiasm than the situation warranted. "Hell of a thing, coming home to find that woman squatting on your property." "She wasn't squatting," Granger blinked. "Well, I mean, she was managing the property, doing a better job of it than it was being done before I left." Wade kept his voice level. "Anything else?" There was a pause. Granger recovered his ground. "She came in here asking for a line of credit," he said, dropping his voice like he was sharing something embarrassing. "About 6 months back, I told her I didn't know her from Adam, and she wasn't going to get credit on some ranch she had no legal claim to. Can't blame me for that." "No," Wade agreed. "I can't. People wondered about her. Woman out there alone, no husband, no family, living on some man's land. Living on my land," Wade said, "doing my work while I was gone and keeping the whole place from going to the bank, which I appreciate." He picked up his supplies and looked at Granger steadily. "You'll give her credit if she asks for it again. Put it on my account until we get the paperwork sorted." Granger opened his mouth and closed it. "Sure, Wade, whatever you say." The bank was worse, in a quieter way. The loan officer, a younger man named Pettigrew, who wore his city manners like a new suit that hadn't broken in yet, spoke about Eleanor with a kind of careful, almost polished dismissal that Wade found harder to stomach than Granger's open gossip. "A difficult situation," Pettigrew said, folding his hands on the desk. "We weren't entirely sure how to proceed with the payments she was making, whether to accept them given the irregular circumstances." "You accepted them." "We did. Technically, they kept the note from defaulting, so..." He adjusted his papers. "We did wonder, of course, about the propriety. The payments kept the note current," Wade said, "which is what payments are for." "Were there any problems with the actual money?" "Well, no." "Then I don't know what the propriety question is." On the ride home, Wade passed 3 separate clusters of cattle on rangeland he recognized as belonging to neighbors. Smaller operations, family places that had been working that ground for 20 years. The herds looked thinner than he remembered. The fences along 2 of the properties had gaps that hadn't been filled. One place he passed, the Dunnigan Spread, had a for sale notice nailed to the gatepost. He stopped his horse and read it twice. Eleanor was in the yard when he got back, mending a piece of harness with a leather punch and a length of fresh lacing. She glanced up when he rode in, read something in his face, and waited for him to unsaddle and put the horse up before she said anything. "How bad was it?" she asked when he came out of the barn. "About what I expected." He leaned against the fence. "Dunnigan's selling. You know anything about that?" Something moved behind her eyes. "I know some things," she said carefully. "I've been trying to work out how much of it is connected." "Connected to what?" She set down the harness and looked at him directly. "Victor Kane," she said. Wade knew the name. Anyone in the valley knew the name. Kane had built up a significant operation east of town over the past several years. buying and leasing land at a rate that had impressed people at first and started to make some of them uneasy later. He was a well-dressed, smooth-spoken man of about 50 who gave generously at public events and sat on the bank's board of directors and had a lawyer on retainer that people in town talked about in careful voices. What about him? Sit down, Eleanor said. This is going to take a while. She went inside and came back with a packet of folded papers, land filings, mostly, and some handwritten notes in her own sharp, economical hand. She spread them on the top of the fence rail and began walking him through them, and Wade, who had spent 2 years making and losing money on the cattle trails and thought he understood something about how business worked, felt a cold, slow certainty building in his chest as she talked. Kane had been buying distressed properties. That much anyone could see. But what Eleanor had traced, through months of careful observation and a habit of paying attention to things people said when they thought no one important was listening, was a pattern underneath the buying. A pattern that had to do with water. The valley's 3 main water sources, the creek that ran through the lower quarter, the spring on the North Ridge, and the irrigation rights attached to the old Halsey land grant, were connected to specific parcels. Kane had acquired one of them outright 18 months ago. He'd gotten a second through a foreclosure that Eleanor had been watching with growing suspicion. The third, the spring rights, was attached to a property currently owned by a family named Faber, who were, according to what Eleanor had seen and heard, being pressured in ways that weren't quite visible from the outside. If he gets the Faber place, Eleanor said, he controls how much water moves through this valley. Not all of it, but enough. Enough to make things very difficult for anyone he wants to make things difficult for. Wade stared at the papers. How long have you known this? I've been putting it together for about 4 months. I wasn't sure at first. I didn't want to say anything until I was. She paused. I wrote to the county land office and asked for copies of some of the filings. It took time, but they came. It's all there. Why didn't you? He stopped. Tell someone? A small, humorless curve of her mouth. Who was I going to tell, Wade? The banker who didn't want to accept my payments? The feed store owner who told me to come back with a husband? I'm the woman who had no legal right to be here. Nobody in this valley was going to listen to me about Victor Kane. The words landed with a weight she hadn't put on them. She was stating a fact, not asking for sympathy. And that somehow made them heavier. They might now, he said. They might, she agreed. If the evidence is solid enough, if we present it right. She began folding the papers back into the packet. I've been trying to figure out how to do that. We, Wade said. She looked up. Her expression was careful, reading him. You said we, he said. Present it right. You meant both of us. I meant me, she said. I was being imprecise. No, you weren't. She was quiet for a moment. The evening light was coming in flat and orange from the west, throwing long shadows across the yard. And somewhere on the north pasture, one of the cattle was lowing in that repetitive, almost bored way that meant nothing was wrong. It was just making noise. Normal sounds of a working ranch at end of day. I don't need your permission, Eleanor said slowly, to keep doing what I've been doing. I want that to be clear. It's clear. But you being back changes some things. Practically. You have standing I don't have. If we're going to take this to the Ranchers' Council, people will listen to you in a way they won't listen to me. And I'm not so proud that I'll pretend that doesn't matter. No, Wade said. You're smarter than that. She tilted her head slightly, uncertain whether that was a compliment. He hadn't entirely decided yet himself. The Faber place, he said. How much time do you think they have? A month? Maybe 6 weeks? Kane's been patient, but I don't think he's going to wait much longer. There's a council meeting in 3 weeks. She looked at him. If we're going to do this, that's the time. Suck. The next weeks had a particular kind of exhaustion to them. The useful kind. The kind that comes from doing necessary things rather than just hard ones. Wade sent 3 letters to former contacts on the cattle circuit and got 2 replies that confirmed pieces of what Eleanor had already put together. Dillard, who said nothing about any of it but clearly understood the shape of the situation, kept the daily operations running with his usual quiet competence, which freed Wade and Eleanor to work through the evidence in the evenings after supper. They argued sometimes. Not badly, more like two people who both had opinions and weren't used to being in a room with someone who would push back. Eleanor had a habit of getting ahead of her conclusions, building a case quickly from partial information and having to be talked back to the actual evidence. Wade had the opposite problem, a caution that Eleanor occasionally called something less charitable. "You're stalling," she said one night, when they'd been going around a particular question about the water rights documentation for the better part of an hour. "I'm being careful. You've been careful about this specific page for 40 minutes. Because if we take it to the council and we're wrong, we're not wrong." She said it simply, with the certainty of someone who had lived with the information for months. "I've checked this 4 times. The filing dates don't line up with what Kane has told the county. He filed for these rights before the Hendersons officially defaulted, which means he knew about the default before it was public record, which means someone at the bank—" "Pettigrew," Wade said quietly. "Probably Pettigrew." She leaned back in her chair and rubbed her eyes. "Or someone above Pettigrew. I don't know how high it goes." The fire had burned down to embers. Outside, the night was clear and cold for August, the kind of cold that reminded you that the mountains didn't care what month it was. Wade got up and put another piece of wood on the fire. "My father built this ranch," he said, not exactly to her, more to the room. "Spent 30 years on it. He died thinking it was going to go to nothing." He turned back. "And then you showed up." Eleanor looked at him. Her expression was difficult to read, cautious, a little tired, not quite willing to meet the weight of what he'd said. "I needed somewhere to be," she said, which was what she'd said before, but quieter this time. "I know." He sat back down. "I know that's what you said. I'm not sure I believe it was all of it." She didn't answer right away. Outside the window, the wind moved through the grass, and the coals shifted in the fireplace. And in the bunkhouse, Dillard was probably already asleep, the way he always was by this hour. "I was tired of being somewhere nobody wanted me," she said finally. "I wanted to find out what I was capable of without someone deciding the answer for me." She paused. "This place needed doing. I could do it. That felt like enough reason." Wade nodded slowly. "It was enough," he said. "More than enough." She picked up her pencil and went back to the papers. He watched her for a moment. This woman he hadn't known 3 weeks ago, who had saved a thing he'd been afraid to come home and find ruined, and thought about how badly a person could misread a situation and still somehow end up somewhere that made sense. "The Faber meeting," Eleanor said, without looking up. "We should go together, both of us. It matters that they see us together." "I know. And the council meeting—" "I know, Eleanor." She did look up then, just briefly. Something in her face that might have been, under other circumstances, almost a smile. "You're going to tell me to slow down. I'm going to tell you we have 3 weeks and we should sleep sometimes." "That's the same thing." "Close enough," he said, and reached for the nearest stack of papers because they had more work to do, and neither of them was the kind of person who left necessary things undone. Mutt. 2 days later, they rode out to the Faber place together. It was a small operation. Carl Faber and his wife Ruth, and their youngest son, a boy of about 16 who did the work of 2 men without appearing to think much about it. The land was good land, well tended, and the spring on the north corner of the property was exactly what Eleanor had said, the key to half the valley's water come dry season. Carl Faber was a thick, quiet man who'd been at this work his whole life, and wore the particular expression of someone who'd been under pressure so long he'd forgotten what ordinary felt like. He shook Wade's hand. He nodded at Eleanor with careful, neutral politeness. She'd been here before, Wade guessed, from the way Ruth Faber immediately offered coffee, and the way Carl didn't ask how they knew each other. They sat in the kitchen, and Wade laid out the basics of what they'd found, and Carl Faber listened without interrupting. When Wade finished, Carl was quiet for a while, and then he looked at Eleanor. "You put this together?" he said. "Most of it," she said. Wade confirmed some of the later pieces. Carl looked at the papers on his table. "Kane came by last week," he said. "Made an offer. Not a terrible offer from the outside, but Ruth and I have been here 18 years. He stopped. He was polite. He's always polite. But there was something in the way he said what he said. He shook his head. I don't know if I can fight this. I don't have money for lawyers. You might not need lawyers, Eleanor said. Not yet. What you need is to not sign anything and to come to the Ranchers' Council meeting in 3 weeks. Can you do that? Carl looked at his wife. Ruth looked back at him. The kind of look that passes between two people who've built something together for a long time and know how to talk without words. We can do that, Carl said. On the ride back, Eleanor was quiet for a while, looking at the road ahead of her with the expression of someone turning things over in their mind. He looked at you to verify it, she said eventually. Wade didn't insult her by pretending not to know what she meant. Yeah. Even though I'm the one who found it. Yeah. He looked at the road. I'm sorry about that. She was quiet for another moment. Don't be sorry. Just be there. At the council meeting, both of us, both names. That's what matters. Both names, he said. Both names. The afternoon sun was pressing down hot on the trail, and the horses moved at an easy walk through the dust, and somewhere ahead the ranch was waiting with its new fence posts and its filled water troughs and its ledger of careful, honest accounts. And the whole weight of what was coming was just beginning to make itself felt. Eleanor Hart straightened in the saddle and kept her eyes on the road. She'd been fighting for this place for 8 months without anyone to fight beside her, and she knew how to do it. The only thing that had changed was that now, finally, there were 2 names in the fight instead of 1. Whether that would be enough was something neither of them could know yet, but they were going to find out. The week before the Ranchers' Council meeting, Alderman's Crossing had a particular kind of quiet to it. The kind that isn't actually quiet at all, but is made up of people talking in rooms they think you can't hear into. Wade noticed it the second time he rode into town, 2 weeks after his first visit. The looks were different now. Not the open curiosity of a man returned from a long absence that had faded fast, but something more careful, more deliberate. Men who'd known him since boyhood found reasons to be looking the other direction when he passed. The woman at the post office was pleasant enough, but she moved the conversation along faster than she needed to. He was in the hardware store picking up a replacement hinge when he heard Kane's name spoken behind him, and he went still without making it obvious he'd gone still. 2 men he half recognized, one of them worked for the bank, the other he thought was connected to Kane's operation in some capacity, were talking in the far aisle, with the comfortable ease of people who believed themselves unobserved. Said she's been writing to the county land office, asking questions about filings. What kind of questions? The kind that are none of her business is what kind. A pause, the sound of something being moved on a shelf. Kane know about it? Kane knows about everything. Wade set his hinge on the counter and paid for it and left without hurrying. On the ride back, he turned that exchange over in his mind until it sat somewhere uncomfortable but useful. He told Eleanor that evening. She received the information without visible surprise, which he'd started to recognize as her way. She absorbed things internally and processed them, and then, usually sometime later, you'd see whatever conclusion she'd reached show up in something she did or decided. She didn't perform reaction. He's been watching, she said. Appears so. Then he probably knows what we have. She poured coffee into both their cups. Or he suspects, which means he'll try to do something before the council meeting. What kind of something? Legal, most likely. That's how he operates. He'll find some angle on the paperwork, file something to muddy the water, maybe try to get an injunction that delays the meeting or limits who can present. He has a lawyer who's good at that kind of thing. She sat down and looked at her cup. Or he'll try to discredit the evidence through me. Through you how? She was quiet for a moment. He'll tell people what people already half believe. That I'm nobody, that I have no stake in this valley, that I was squatting on your property, and now I've convinced you of something that isn't true. She paused. He won't have to work very hard at it. The material's already there. Wade looked at her across the table. She was saying it plainly, without self-pity, and that was somehow harder to sit with than if she'd been angry. You worried about that? He asked. I'm practical about it, she said. There's a difference. She looked up at him. The only thing that neutralizes it is the evidence being airtight. which is why I want to go over the Pettigrew connection one more time tonight. I think there's a gap in the timeline I haven't accounted for. They worked until past midnight, and the gap she'd identified turned out to be not a gap, but a confirmation. A filing date that lined up so precisely with the bank's internal schedule that it couldn't have been coincidence. Eleanor wrote it out in her ledger in her small, dense handwriting and set the pencil down and rubbed her eyes. "That's it," she said. "That's the piece I was missing." Outside, the night had gone fully dark and the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. Wade stood and stretched his back and looked at the papers spread across the table. Weeks of Eleanor's careful work, organized into something that had weight and teeth. "You should have been a lawyer," he said. She snorted. "They wouldn't have let me." "Probably not." He started stacking the papers into order. "Doesn't make it less true." She didn't answer that. She rarely accepted things that were offered as compliments. Not from modesty exactly, but from some habit of caution that he was starting to understand came from a long history of compliments that came with strings attached. The Faber situation moved faster than either of them had planned. 3 days before the council meeting, Carl came riding into the Mercer place in the middle of the afternoon with a look on his face that told Wade the news before Carl had even dismounted. "He filed," Carl said, "some kind of provisional lien on the spring rights. Lawyer brought the papers out this morning." Eleanor came out of the barn at the sound of hooves, wiping her hands on a work rag. Wade watched her read Carl's expression the same way he had. "Let me see the papers," she said. Carl handed them over. Eleanor read them standing in the yard, and Wade watched her face and could not quite tell what she was finding, whether it was as bad as it looked or worse. She read the full document twice, then handed it back to Carl. "It's not a lien," she said. "It's a claim of prior interest. He's arguing that an 1871 agreement between the original Halsey land grant holder and Kane's predecessor gives Kane a legal right of first refusal on any transfer of the spring rights." She paused. "It's a stretch. A real stretch. But if a judge accepts the argument, it freezes any sale or transfer long enough to make us miss the council meeting," Carl said. "Long enough to make it irrelevant, yes. If he can establish the claim before the meeting, it changes what the meeting can actually accomplish." Carl stood in the yard with his hat in his hands, looking at the ground, and Wade understood that this man had 18 years in that land and a son who'd grown up working it, and a wife who'd turned a homestead into something real, and all of it was sitting on whether a piece of paper filed by a rich man's lawyer could be answered fast enough. "What do we do?" Carl asked. Eleanor was already thinking. You could see it, the slight stillness that came over her when she was moving fast through a problem internally. The 1871 agreement, if it exists, would be in the county records. If Kane is citing it, it has to be on file. But if his claim is that it gives him prior interest on the Faber property specifically, the legal description in that agreement has to match the current parcel boundaries, and those boundaries were redrawn in 1876 after the county survey. She looked at Wade. "The 1876 survey is in the county records too." "You think the boundaries don't match?" "I think Kane is betting that nobody checks, or that by the time anyone does, it won't matter." She turned back to Carl. "I need you to ride to the county seat and request a copy of both documents. Today, if you can. Tell them it's urgent." Carl looked at her, then at Wade. "That's 2 days of riding." "One day if you push," Eleanor said. "I know it's a lot to ask, but if we can show the legal description doesn't match the current survey, the claim falls apart." She met his eyes. "I wouldn't ask if I didn't think it would work." Carl put his hat back on. "I'll go today," he said. After he'd ridden out, Wade stood in the yard with Eleanor and said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "You're sure about the boundaries?" 80% sure." "That's not 100. "No," she agreed. "It's not." She started back toward the barn. "If I'm wrong, we find another angle. There's always another angle." There was no word from Carl for 2 days, which was expected, and the 2 days had their own particular tension. The kind of waiting that makes ordinary work feel like it's happening at a remove, like you're watching yourself do it from somewhere slightly outside your body. Wade found himself checking the road from the north more than he needed to. Eleanor didn't check the road, as far as he could tell, but he noticed she made more mistakes in the evenings than usual, small ones, catching herself and correcting without comment. Dillard, who paid attention to more than he ever said, started making coffee in the evenings without being asked. Carl came back on the morning of the day before the council meeting. He had the documents. Eleanor spread them on the kitchen table and went through them with the focused efficiency of someone who has a very short time to confirm or deny something that matters considerably. Wade stood across the table from her and watched and didn't interrupt. After 4 minutes, she put her hand flat on one of the pages. "Here," she said. The 1871 agreement described the spring rights as attached to a parcel running north to the first ridge marker and east to what the document called the Galloway Creek boundary. The 1876 county survey showed clearly, and with the signatures of 2 official surveyors, that the parcel boundaries had been redrawn when the creek shifted course. The current Faber property had a different eastern boundary entirely. The legal description in Kane's claim referred to land that, by 1876, had been reassigned. "The claim is hollow," Eleanor said. The words came out flat and certain. Carl, who had ridden 2 days and slept rough and pushed himself because she'd asked him to, let out a breath that had been sitting somewhere in his chest since the lawyer's papers arrived. Wade looked at the documents and then at Eleanor. "Can we get this in front of the council?" "We can do better than that," she said. "We file a response with the county clerk today, attach both documents, and then we bring copies to the meeting tomorrow. Kane can argue about it afterward if he wants, but the council will see it." Carl sat down heavily in one of the kitchen chairs. "If I hadn't gone and got these—" "But you did," Eleanor said. Not warmly, exactly, but firmly. The way you speak to someone who needs to understand that the thing they did mattered. "You did, and now we have what we need." That afternoon, Wade rode into Alderman's Crossing alone and filed the response with the county clerk, a small transaction that took less than 10 minutes and would matter more than anything else that happened that week. The clerk took the documents without comment and stamped them with the officious, slightly bored certainty of someone processing paperwork all day who doesn't know which pieces will turn out to mean something. On the ride home, Wade let the horse set its own pace. He thought about his father, who had spent 30 years on land that nearly went to nothing. He thought about Barlow, who had walked away from the responsibility because it was easier to leave than to stay. He thought about the valley he'd ridden back into 6 weeks ago, expecting to find ruin, and about the woman who had decided to stay when it would have been simpler to go. By the time he reached the ranch, the evening was settling in cool and orange across the pasture. Eleanor was at the water trough with one of the younger cattle, checking something about the animal's left foreleg, with patient, competent hands, not looking up. She hadn't needed him to come back, he thought. She would have fought this fight without him, would have found a way to be heard eventually, would have kept the ranch from going under and kept building her case and kept being what she was, regardless of whether Wade Mercer had ever ridden back down that road. The difference he made was that now she didn't have to do it alone. He wasn't sure, standing there watching her work, that he entirely deserved the luck of that. But he wasn't going to waste it. "Tomorrow," he said from the fence. She looked up. "Tomorrow," she agreed, and went back to the animal, and the last of the light pressed itself low and long across the valley floor. The Alderman's Crossing. Ranchers' Council met in the back room of the Grange Hall, which was a generous name for a space that was really just 4 walls, a plank floor, and enough mismatched chairs to seat about 30 people if nobody was particular about comfort. It smelled like sawdust and old coffee and the particular staleness of a room that got used once a month and aired out not quite enough in between. By the time Wade and Eleanor arrived, every chair was taken and men were standing along the walls 3 deep. That was the first sign that something had changed. Council meetings in Alderman's Crossing were not typically well attended. Ranchers came when they had to, voted on whatever needed voting on, and got back to work. The room filling up like this meant word had spread. About the filing, about Kane's claim, about the Fabers, about whatever version of events had been circulating through the town and the valley for the past week. Wade felt it when they walked in, the shift in the room. Eyes moving to them, then moving away, then coming back. He recognized most of the faces. Men he'd grown up around, families that had been working this valley since before he was born. Some of them nodded at him. A few of them looked at Eleanor with an expression he'd learned to read as the particular discomfort of a person confronting something they've said behind someone's back and are now having to stand near in person. Eleanor didn't look at any of them. She was carrying the packet of documents under her arm, and she walked to the near side of the room and found a place to stand against the wall and stood there with the same stillness she brought to everything. And if she felt the weight of 40 pairs of eyes making calculations about her, she gave nothing away. Kane was already there. He was seated near the front, one leg crossed over the other, his hat on his knee, talking in a low voice to the man beside him. His lawyer, a city-dressed man named Alt, whom Wade had seen twice before and disliked both times. Kane was a big man, not heavy, but broad, with silver hair and the kind of face that had probably been handsome 20 years ago and had since settled into something more like authority. He didn't look up when Wade and Eleanor came in, which was its own kind of statement. Thomas Briggs, who ran the council and had been running it for 11 years and showed every sign of intending to run it until he died, called the meeting to order with the flat efficiency of a man who had somewhere else he'd rather be. He got through the routine business in about 15 minutes. Water table reports, a grazing rights dispute on the eastern edge of the valley, a proposal about road maintenance that nobody wanted to fund, and then he looked at his paper and said, "We have a matter raised by Wade Mercer regarding land use and water rights in the lower valley." Wade stepped forward. He'd thought about how to do this, whether to lead with the evidence or with the story, whether to let Eleanor present first, or whether that would work against them before people had heard enough to listen with open minds. They'd talked about it the night before for an hour and not entirely agreed, and what they'd landed on was that Wade would open and Eleanor would present the documentation, because that was the practical reality of the room, and neither of them had the luxury of pretending otherwise. He kept it short. He laid out the pattern, the acquisitions, the water rights, the timeline, the way the pieces fit together. And he kept his voice level and didn't editorialize and let the facts carry whatever weight they had. When he finished, he said, "Eleanor Hart has the documentation. She put this together, and she can walk you through it better than I can." There was a murmur in the room. Wade stepped back. Eleanor moved forward. That was when Kane spoke. He didn't stand up. He spoke from his chair, which was either a deliberate choice or the kind of habit that comes from decades of being the person in the room whose voice carries without effort. "I wonder," Kane said pleasantly, "if we might first establish who exactly is presenting this information." He looked at Eleanor with the particular brand of polite attention that is designed to make the person on the receiving end feel like a problem to be managed. "Miss Hart, isn't it? I understand you've been staying on the Mercer property." Eleanor stopped. She looked at Kane with the same expression she'd had the morning Wade rode in, and she was standing on his porch with a shotgun, measuring, controlled, giving nothing away. "That's right," she said. "And you're not a landowner in this valley. You have no legal stake in any of the properties under discussion." "I'm presenting evidence," she said, "not a legal claim." "Evidence gathered by whom? Under what authority?" Kane's voice was friendly. That was the worst part of it, the friendliness, the tone of a man asking reasonable questions. "This council typically hears from members of the community, people with standing, people who have built something here, contributed something, who have—" He paused just long enough. "Roots." The room was very quiet. "I'm not sure," Kane continued, "that it serves this council well to base its discussions on the work of a woman who arrived here. When was it? 8 months ago? With no property, no family connections, no history in this valley, and who has been living on another man's land under circumstances that, frankly, several people in this room have wondered about." The last sentence landed exactly the way he'd meant it to. Wade felt the heat move through him. Not the hot, impulsive kind, but the cold, focused kind that sits lower and lasts longer. He started to speak, and Eleanor put one hand out slightly, not touching him, just a small movement at the edge of his vision, and he stopped. She turned back to Kane. "You're welcome to question my standing," she said. Her voice was even, completely even. "That's your right, but the documents I'm holding were issued by the Calhoun County Land Office. They carry the county seal. My name isn't on them. Your name is. And the dates are, and the legal descriptions are. So if you'd like to argue about who I am, we can do that. Or we can look at what the papers say." A sound moved through the room, not applause, nothing so clear, more like a collective shift in posture, people adjusting their weight, the subtle physical recalibration of a group that is paying more attention than it was a moment ago. Kane smiled. It was a good smile, practiced, warm at the surface, cold underneath. "Of course," he said. "Please, continue." She continued. She went through it methodically, without flourish, the way you present something when you know the thing itself is enough, and adding drama to it would only give people permission to dismiss it as performance. The timeline of acquisitions, the water rights filings and their dates, the 1871 Halsey Agreement, and the 1876 county survey that invalidated Kane's claim on the Faber Spring, the pattern of distressed sales that preceded each of Kane's purchases, and the specific documented connections between those sales and the bank's internal schedule. She named Pettigrew. She did it without hesitation, and she had the document dates to support it, and the room went very quiet in a different way when she did. The quiet of people putting things together. Carl Faber was standing against the far wall, and Wade watched his face as Eleanor laid out the spring rights argument and watched the moment Carl understood that the thing he'd ridden 2 days to retrieve had done exactly what Eleanor said it would do. When she finished, she lowered the papers and looked at Thomas Briggs. "Everything I've presented is on file with the county clerk as of yesterday," she said. "Copies are available for anyone who wants to verify." Briggs looked at Kane. Kane had not moved from his chair. His lawyer was writing something on a notepad beside him, quickly, with the focused penmanship of a man trying to locate an exit. "This is an interesting presentation," Kane said, and the friendliness had not quite left his voice, but something underneath it had shifted. "But I'd point out that the interpretation of these documents is contested. The 1871 agreement's applicability to current parcel boundaries is a legal question that can't be settled in a Grange Hall." "You're right that it's a legal question," Eleanor said, "which is why we're not asking this council to settle it. We're asking this council to look at the pattern and decide whether they'd like to ask a federal land office investigator to look at it too." And that was the thing she and Wade had agreed on the night before, the thing she'd been building toward, not asking the council for a verdict, because they didn't have that authority, and Kane knew it, but asking for something that Kane's lawyers couldn't argue against without looking like they had something to hide. The room started talking all at once. Briggs called for order twice before he got it. And then something happened that neither Wade nor Eleanor had planned for. A man named Horace Whitfield, who'd been running a small cattle operation on the north side of the valley for 15 years, and who Wade had always known as a quiet, deliberate man who didn't say much in public forums, stood up. "I sold my east pasture to Kane's Land Company 8 months ago," Whitfield said. He had the voice of someone who doesn't speak in crowds often and has to remember how. "I sold it because the bank told me the note was being called. I've been trying to figure out why they called it when they did. My payments were current." He looked at the documents in Eleanor's hands. "I'd like to see the dates on those bank filings." Eleanor held them out without a word. Whitfield crossed the room and took them and looked. His face while he read was still and closed. Then he handed them back. "The date they told me the note was being called," he said, to the room rather than to anyone specific, "is 3 days after the date on that bank document." He sat down. Another man, Hansen, who'd lost his lower pasture 18 months ago to what he'd believed was a legitimate foreclosure, stood up slowly. Then a woman Wade didn't know well, from one of the properties north of the Faber place. Then one of the Dunning brothers, whose family had been in the valley for 2 generations. One by one. Not many. 5, 6 people. But in a room this size, 5 or 6 people standing up carries a particular weight. Kane stood. For the first time in the meeting, he was on his feet, and whatever calculation he'd been making behind the pleasant expression had shifted into something more openly strategic. "This is a collection of grievances being organized around a speculative narrative," he said, and his voice was still controlled, but the friendliness was entirely gone. "I have legal rights in this valley. I have filed properly and acted within the law at every stage. What's happening here is a campaign of innuendo led by—" He turned and he looked at Eleanor with an expression that was not polite at all. "By a woman with no stake in this community, no property, no family, nothing that would give her any reason to care about this valley beyond whatever arrangement she's made with Mercer there." The room went still in a way that was different from the other kinds of still. A harder still. Wade was already moving forward, and then he stopped himself because there was something in him that needed to say what he was about to say from where he was standing, clearly, so that the whole room could hear it, and it couldn't be dismissed as a private defense. Eleanor Hart has more stake in this valley than half the people in this room, he said. His voice was flat and clear and carried. She's the reason the Mercer Ranch exists right now. She saved it when I wasn't here to save it. She spent 8 months working land she had no legal claim to because it needed doing, and she was the one who could do it. She built the case that's sitting in front of you right now. Not because she wanted anything out of it, but because she saw what was happening and she gave a damn when it would have been easier not to. He looked at Kane. And the thing she found is real. The dates are what they are. You can have your lawyer explain the Halsey Agreement all you like. But those boundary survey documents were filed in 1876, and they say what they say, and everybody in this room who's done business with the bank in the last 3 years needs to be wondering about the timing. He wasn't finished, and everyone could tell, and the room held its breath. Eleanor's name goes on the deed for the Mercer Ranch, he said. Equal partner. That's already decided. But what I want this council to understand is that that decision doesn't come from anything she asked for. It comes from what she earned. And the fact that it took her doing all of this before anyone in this valley was willing to hear what she had to say is something we all ought to think about. The silence after that was long enough to be uncomfortable. Briggs cleared his throat. The motion before the council, he said carefully, is to request a formal review by the Federal Land Office of the water rights transactions in this valley over the past 2 years. All in favor? The count wasn't unanimous. 3 men voted against it, one of whom Wade recognized as having business dealings with Kane, and the other 2 were older men who voted no on everything involving federal involvement on principle. But the ayes were clear and decisive, and Briggs recorded them with the expression of a man who has just presided over something that is going to matter more than he entirely wanted it to. Kane's lawyer was already leaning close to Kane's ear when the vote finished. Kane himself looked across the room at Eleanor. Not at Wade, at Eleanor. With an expression that had finally dropped every performance and was just what it was underneath. A man who has lost the first round of something he expected to win easily, recalculating. Eleanor looked back at him. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Briggs adjourned the meeting, and the room broke into the particular noise of people who have witnessed something significant and are not yet sure how to talk about it. Wade felt hands on his shoulder. Carl Faber, then Whitfield, then a man he barely knew from the north end of the valley. He answered questions for 20 minutes and directed half of them to Eleanor, who answered them with the same patient precision she'd brought to the presentation, and he watched the room do the thing rooms do when they've been turned. People who'd avoided her eye when she walked in were now standing in line to speak to her. She handled it without visible pleasure and without false modesty. She answered what needed answering, and when someone asked a question she didn't know the answer to, she said so. When the room had thinned enough, Wade found himself standing near the door with Eleanor, both of them putting on coats against the October cold that was waiting outside, and he said low enough that only she could hear, "You all right?" She thought about it for a second, which was more than most people would do. "Ask me again when we see what Kane does next," she said. Outside, the night was clear and cold, and the stars were sharp overhead. Down the street, the saloon was lit and loud. Ordinary life going on alongside the extraordinary thing that had just happened, because that was how things worked. The world didn't stop to mark the moments that mattered. Wade brought the horses around, and they rode out of Alderman's Crossing side by side, not talking much, the cold air moving past them, and the dark valley spreading out on either side of the road. He didn't know what Kane was going to do next. He didn't know if the Federal Land Office would move fast enough, or thoroughly enough, or at all. He didn't know if what they'd built in that room tonight was solid enough to hold against whatever was coming. What he knew was that Eleanor Hart had walked into a room full of people who had already decided what she was worth, and she had changed their minds with nothing but the truth and the patience she'd spent months building it with. And whatever came next, nobody in that room was going to forget it. She rode with her eyes on the road ahead, her back straight, the packet of documents tucked into her saddlebag like a thing that had done its work and could rest now. The ranch was a dark shape against darker hills when it came into view, and the light in the bunkhouse window meant Dillard was still up, which meant coffee was probably on. It wasn't finished, not even close. But tonight, at least, they'd done what they came to do. Kane moved fast, faster than Wade had expected, which meant he'd had contingency plans already in place. The kind of preparation that told you something about how confident he'd been going into that meeting, and how seriously he was taking the result. Within 4 days of the council vote, a letter arrived at the Mercer Ranch from Alt's law office in the county seat. It was written in the careful, dense language that lawyers use when they want to say something threatening while maintaining the appearance of simply clarifying facts. The substance of it, stripped of its professional dressing, was this: Kane was filing a civil claim against Eleanor Hart for unauthorized use and management of private property, the Mercer Ranch, during the period of Wade's absence. The claim alleged financial damages. It named Eleanor specifically, not Wade, which was either an oversight or, more likely, a deliberate calculation about who was the easier target. Eleanor read it at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold beside her. She read it twice, set it down, and looked at the wall for a moment. "He's trying to tie up your time and your money," Wade said. He'd read it over her shoulder and felt something cold and methodical settle into him. Legal fees, depositions, it doesn't matter if he wins. It just has to cost enough that we can't focus on anything else. "I know what he's doing." She picked up the letter again. "He's also sending a message to the other ranchers. Anyone thinking about coming forward, anyone who talked to us after the meeting, they see this and they think about whether they want to be next." She set it down again. "It's not a bad move. It's a rotten move. Those aren't mutually exclusive." She stood and poured her cold coffee into the basin. "I need to talk to someone who knows land law, not a county clerk, an actual attorney. There's Harmon in Calhoun City. Harmon does wills and property transfers. I need someone who's handled federal land disputes." She turned around and leaned against the counter. Carl mentioned someone, a lawyer in Millhaven who did work for the Cattlemen's Association a few years back. "I want to talk to him." "That's 3 days' ride." "I know." Wade looked at her. "I'll go." "We both go. I need to be there. He needs to hear it from me, and I need to be the one who decides what we tell him and what we hold back." She paused. "Dillard can manage for a week." Dillard, when told, said nothing for a moment and then said, "Don't be longer than a week. The north fence has a weak post I've been watching." "We'll be back in 6 days," Eleanor said. 5 would be better. They left the next morning. The ride to Millhaven took them through country that grew steadily more open as the valley gave way to the broader plain, and the sky above them on the second day was the kind of enormous autumn sky that made a person feel both very small and very clear-headed, which was not the worst combination for the circumstances. They talked some and were quiet some, and the quiet between them had gradually, over the weeks since Wade's return, changed from the careful quiet of two people navigating unfamiliar territory to something more like the quiet of people who didn't need to fill every silence. The lawyer's name was Sewell. He worked out of a 2-room office above a dry goods store and had the distracted, overworked manner of a man with more cases than ours. But he sat with them for 2 hours and read everything Eleanor had brought and asked questions that were quick and specific and showed he understood what he was looking at. At the end of it, he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "The civil claim against Miss Hart is nuisance litigation," he said. "It'll cost you to defend, but he's not going to win it. Mercer, you'll need to file an affidavit making clear that you authorize everything she did on your property, retroactively and explicitly. We get that on record, most of his argument evaporates." He looked at Eleanor. "What he should be more worried about is the federal review. The civil claim is a distraction. What he wants is to slow you down long enough to get ahead of the investigators." "How much time do we have?" Eleanor asked. "Depends on how quickly the land office moves, and those offices move like they're wading through mud, as a general rule. Could be 2 months before they send anyone. Could be 4. He tapped the papers. "But this material is solid. The boundary survey, the filing dates, the bank connection. If the investigators are competent, they'll find what you found and then some. These things have a way of being bigger than they look from the outside. What do we do in the meantime? You keep gathering. Anyone in that valley who sold land in the last 3 years and has questions about how it happened, you talk to them. You document everything. You don't confront Kane directly, and you don't make claims in public that you can't back up with paper. He looked at her steadily. And you don't get rattled when he comes at you again, because he will. I know, she said. On the ride back, they stopped the first night at a small way station run by an older woman who fed them beef stew that was mostly pepper and not much else. And they sat at a rough table eating it without complaint because it was hot and they were tired. What he said, Wade started, about coming at you again. I heard him. I want to know you're prepared for it to get uglier. Eleanor set down her spoon. Wade, I've been prepared for ugly since I was about 15 years old. She said it without drama, looking at her bowl. I'm not worried about ugly. I'm worried about slow. If the land office takes 4 months and Kane spends that time picking off the ranchers who spoke up at the meeting, she stopped. Whitfield, the Dunning brother who stood up. If Kane goes after them the way he went after me, they might not have 4 months. It was a real problem, and they both knew it. Wade thought about it through the second half of his meal and then said, Sewell said these things are usually bigger than they look from outside. He did. What if we help the investigators find that out faster? Eleanor looked at him. What are you thinking? Sewell said the bank connection is the key. Pettigrew, whoever's above Pettigrew. That's what connects the individual cases into a pattern. If the investigators walk in with just the Faber documents, they look at the Faber case. But if they walk in with documented connections between the bank and 6 or 8 property transactions, they're not looking at a local dispute, Eleanor said slowly. They're looking at a coordinated fraud across multiple counties, which is a different kind of case, a federal kind of case. She was quiet for a moment, working through it. That means talking to everyone who sold, not just the ones who stood up at the meeting, everyone. Yes. That's weeks of work. I know. She picked up her spoon again and looked at the stew. We'd better eat fast then, she said. They were back at the ranch in 5 days, which satisfied Dillard, and they started the next morning. It was slow, unglamorous work, the kind that doesn't look like anything from the outside but accumulates into something real if you're patient enough. They rode out to properties one at a time, sometimes together, sometimes separately when it made more sense for one of them to go alone. Wade handled the men who were more comfortable talking to another man. Eleanor handled the ones who'd already met her, and the ones whose wives turned out to be the ones who actually remembered the dates and kept the paperwork. That last part surprised Wade the first time it happened. Sitting in the Whitfield kitchen while Horace got the chronology confused and his wife Agnes quietly corrected him from across the table, the dates exact and certain in her memory, because she'd been the one dealing with the bank correspondence while Horace was out working. Eleanor caught his eye across the table and said nothing, but her expression said something. In 3 weeks, they had documented 8 separate property transactions with suspicious timing. In 4 weeks, 11. The pattern that emerged was even cleaner than what they'd taken to the council meeting. The bank had been calling notes early, in some cases flagrantly early, always when the corresponding property had water access or water rights of strategic value. Pettigrew's name appeared connected to 6 of the 11 cases. In 2 of them, there was a second name they hadn't seen before, a land company registered out of the territorial capital that turned out, after Eleanor spent 2 evenings with corporate filing records from the county clerk, to be connected to Kane through 2 intermediate entities. He's been doing this for 5 years, Eleanor said one evening. The papers spread across the table in the particular organized disorder of an investigation in progress. At least 5 years. The Mercer note, your note, the one Barlow let go delinquent, I think that was supposed to go the same way. If Barlow had stayed, if the bank had called the note while you were still gone, it would have been sold at foreclosure. And Kane would have had a buyer ready. She looked at the papers. Your ranch sits on the secondary water channel from the North Ridge. I didn't understand why he'd want it specifically. It's not the biggest property in the valley, but if he had the Faber spring rights and your secondary channel, he'd have control of flow to the entire lower valley. Wade sat with that for a moment. The ranch his father had built. The thing he'd nearly lost without knowing it was being targeted. Barlow, he said, for the second time in the weeks since he'd been back, with the same feeling in his mouth. I don't know if Barlow was working with Kane or just a man who happened to be lazy at a convenient time for someone else, Eleanor said. I don't know if it matters now. It mattered to Wade, privately, in the way that things matter when they're personal, even when you know they're beside the point. But she was right that it wasn't the current problem. The federal investigators arrived in Alderman's Crossing on a Thursday in late October. 2 men from the Territorial Land Office, quieter and less dramatic than the situation might have seemed to call for. They set up in a room at the hotel and began meeting with people, and within a week it became clear that they were thorough in the way that bureaucratic processes occasionally and unexpectedly become thorough when the material in front of them is impossible to wave away. Kane's lawyer filed 2 separate motions in county court during this period, both of which Sewell, now engaged formally, paid partly by Wade and partly by a small collective contribution from 4 of the affected ranching families, handled with efficient competence. The civil claim against Eleanor was formally challenged with Wade's affidavit and a counter-filing that made Kane's argument look considerably thinner in official language than it had in the original letter. The second motion, an attempt to limit what records the investigators could access, was denied by the county judge in language that Sewell described as unusually direct. Kane himself had gone quiet in the way that powerful men go quiet, when they are managing a situation behind closed doors rather than in public view. He was still in the valley. His operation was still running. But the visible, confident presence he'd had at the council meeting, the man who sat with one leg crossed over the other and spoke from his chair and let the friendliness do his work, that version of Kane had not been seen in Alderman's Crossing in several weeks. Then Pettigrew resigned from the bank. He did it on a Friday afternoon, and by Saturday morning everyone in town knew. And by Saturday evening, the shape of Y was starting to move through the valley in the way that news moves when it's significant enough to override people's usual caution about speculation. Wade heard 3 different versions of it before he stopped listening, because the versions all agreed on the important thing, that Pettigrew had not resigned voluntarily and that the investigators had been at the bank on Thursday. Eleanor was repairing leather at the workbench when Wade came back from town and told her. She went still for a moment and then went back to the leather. How long before they have enough to act? Wade asked. Sewell thinks they already have enough, she said. The question is whether they act on Kane directly or work inward from the outside. She worked the leather punch through the strap she was holding. Either way, it's out of our hands now. Does that bother you? She thought about it seriously, which was her way. Some, she admitted. I spent 8 months building something I had complete control over. This is different. We handed it to people, and now we wait and hope they do what they're supposed to do. She looked up at him. I'm not good at hoping. I prefer knowing. I know. But Sewell says the material is solid, and I trust Sewell's read, and the only thing I can do that would help is stay available when the investigators have questions. She went back to the leather. So we wait. So we work, she said, and we wait, and we see. 3 days later, 2 more ranching families came to the Mercer place. People who hadn't been at the council meeting, people who'd been watching and hesitating and had now decided the situation had shifted enough that caution was working against them. Eleanor sat with them in the kitchen and listened and took notes and told them what they needed to do, and Wade stood at the counter making coffee and watched her work and thought about the 8 months she'd done all of this alone. The civil claim against her had not yet been formally dismissed. That would take another few weeks in Sewell's continued attention, but it had lost whatever teeth it might have had. The threat of it had shrunk from something that had felt, on the morning the letter arrived, like a real danger to something that now seemed like what it had always been, a tactic, a distraction, a calculation that hadn't worked. Kane had made a mistake somewhere in that calculation. Wade had thought about which mistake, exactly, and his best answer was that Kane had looked at Eleanor and seen someone who could be discredited, someone without roots or standing or the kind of history that gives a person weight in a community. And he had not understood that the absence of those things, for Eleanor, meant she had nothing to protect by staying quiet. A person with roots can be threatened through them. A person who has built something from nothing has already proven they can survive losing everything. And that made her a different kind of opponent than Kane had been dealing with before. Whether Kane had figured that out by now, Wade didn't know. But the investigators were still at the hotel, and Pettigrew was gone, and 4 more families had come forward, and whatever was coming was already in motion. Outside, the first real cold of November was settling into the valley, and the ranch was running tight and well. And in the kitchen, Eleanor was telling a nervous woman named Mrs. Halden exactly what to do with the bank document she'd been afraid to look at for 2 years, patient and specific and completely certain, the way she was when she knew the answer and was going to make sure you understood it too. The valley wasn't saved yet, but it was closer than it had been. And the person who had made it closer was sitting at Wade Mercer's kitchen table, doing the next necessary thing. The investigators left Alderman's Crossing on a Wednesday morning in the second week of November, loading their bags onto the southbound stage with the unhurried efficiency of men who had what they came for and were ready to go process it somewhere with better coffee. They shook hands with Sewell and said nothing to anyone else, which was either a good sign or a neutral one. And the town spent the next several days doing what small towns do when something significant has happened and nobody can yet say what it means, talking around the edges of it, reading omens into ordinary events, waiting. Wade had gotten reasonably good at waiting by this point. It was not a natural skill for him. Eleanor was better at it, or appeared to be, though he'd come to understand that what looked like patience in her was actually a continuous, quiet form of work. She was never simply waiting. She was preparing for whatever came next, which gave the waiting a purpose that kept it from curdling into anxiety. The civil claim against her was formally dismissed on a Friday. Sewell sent word by Ryder, and the note he wrote was 3 sentences, professional and concise, but the last sentence said that, in his opinion, the dismissal reflected a decision on Kane's part to consolidate his legal resources around the federal matter rather than continue fighting on multiple fronts, which Sewell took as a meaningful indicator. Eleanor read the note and set it on the table without ceremony. "Good," she said. That was all. What came next arrived not in a single dramatic moment, but in a series of smaller ones spread across the final weeks of autumn, which was probably more honest than a single dramatic moment would have been. The first was a letter from the Territorial Land Office informing the Calhoun County Bank that a formal audit had been opened into transactions between the bank's commercial lending division and several land acquisition entities over the preceding 5 years. Pettigrew, who had resigned, was named in the letter as a person of interest. The bank's board met in emergency session, and according to what Sewell heard through channels he didn't specify, spent most of that session arguing about who had known what and when, which was its own kind of answer. The second was quieter. A notice filed in county court that Victor Kane's provisional claim on the Faber Spring rights had been withdrawn. No explanation was given because legal withdrawals don't require explanations, but Carl Faber rode over to the Mercer place that afternoon with his hat in his hands and a look on his face like a man who had set down a weight he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten what his shoulders felt like without it. "It's gone," he said, standing in the yard. "The claim, it's just gone." Eleanor came out of the barn where she'd been working. She looked at Carl, and then she did something Wade hadn't seen her do before. She crossed the yard and put a hand briefly on the man's arm, just for a second, and then took it away and said, "Good. How's Ruth?" Carl blinked. She's fine. She's better." "Good," Eleanor said again, and went back to the barn. Carl looked at Wade. Wade looked back at him. "She doesn't make a fuss," Wade said. "No," Carl agreed with the tone of a man revising several opinions at once. The third thing that arrived was harder. 3 weeks after the investigators left, on a cold morning with frost on the ground and the cattle moving slow and steaming in the early light, a rider came from town with a message that Kane had departed the valley. He'd sold his primary residence and operation to an entity out of Kansas City. A quick sale, undervalued, the kind you make when you need to move rather than when you're moving on your own terms. He was gone before anyone thought to mark the moment. Wade told Eleanor at breakfast. She was quiet for longer than usual, long enough that he looked up from his plate and waited. "I wanted him to have to stand in front of people," she said finally. "I wanted the valley to see it, not just gone. Gone doesn't feel like enough." "I know. The families who lost their properties, Whitfield's East Pasture, the Dunnings, they should have gotten to see him answer for it in front of everyone. Maybe they still will." Wade meant the federal matter, which was still open and moving, however slowly. Leaving doesn't close the case. No. She turned her cup in her hands. It's just, you spend that long building something, and then the ending is a man getting on a horse early in the morning when nobody's watching. She paused. It's not a story ending. It's just a thing that happened. He didn't tell her she was wrong to feel it that way. She wasn't. What he said instead was, what he built here is undone. That's real. The families who came to us, the ones who stood up at the meeting, their situations are different now. That's real too. She looked at him for a moment. I know, she said. I know it is. She set down her cup. I just wanted more for them than real. It was, he thought, one of the most honest things she'd ever said to him. The federal case took another 4 months to reach its first formal conclusions. Sewell kept them informed, and what emerged from his periodic updates was a picture considerably larger than what Eleanor had traced from the outside. Kane's operation had touched properties in 3 counties, involved at least 2 bank officers beyond Pettigrew, and had been coordinated through the land company registered out of the territorial capital, which turned out to be connected to a network of similar operations in 2 neighboring territories. It was, as Sewell put it in one of his letters, not a local scheme that had grown large. It was a large scheme that had been applied locally. Of the 11 families whose cases Eleanor had documented, 7 received formal findings in their favor, determinations that the bank had acted improperly in calling their notes and that the subsequent sales or foreclosures were tainted. What this meant practically, in terms of actual remedy, was complicated and slow and incomplete, because the law in 1883 was not well designed for giving things back to people once they'd been taken. Whitfield got his east pasture restored through a combination of the federal finding and a negotiated settlement with Kane's Kansas City buyer, who had no interest in defending a fraudulent acquisition. 2 other families got partial resolutions. The Dunnings did not. Their case had a gap in the documentation that the investigators couldn't bridge, and that was simply what it was. And there was nothing Eleanor or Sewell or anyone else could do to change it. Eleanor took that one harder than she let show. Wade knew because she went quiet in a specific way the evening Sewell's letter about the Dunning case arrived, and she stayed quiet through supper and after. And when he finally said something, she said, I know I didn't miss anything. I looked at their documents 4 times, but that doesn't mean it doesn't feel like I missed something. You didn't. I know I didn't. She looked at the fire. That's the part nobody tells you. You can do everything right, and some of it still doesn't come out the way it should. And you just have to live with that. She was right. And it was a thing worth saying out loud, even if no one wanted to hear it. That justice, when it comes at all, comes unevenly. And the gap between what should happen and what does happen is real and has real weight. And the people who close that gap even partially are not wrong to grieve the part they couldn't close. Pettigrew was formally charged in the spring. The charges were detailed and specific and included the names and transaction dates of 6 property cases. His lawyer negotiated a partial arrangement that reduced the full weight of what he was facing in exchange for cooperation, which meant he confirmed on the record what Eleanor had inferred from the filing dates, that he had been passing information to Kane's operation about which landowners were in financial distress and which notes had flexibility, and that he had done this for 4 years, and that he had been paid. Sewell sent the news with a note that said, simply, Your instincts were correct throughout. Eleanor read it and folded it and put it in the tin box where she kept the important papers. The deed came on a Tuesday morning in early March, when the ground was still half frozen, but the light had started to change the way it does when the season is thinking about turning, even if it hasn't committed yet. Sewell had drafted it. Wade had signed his portion in Millhaven on his last trip out. The final document arrived by post, and Eleanor was at the workbench in the barn when Wade brought it out to her. She was fitting a new handle to a tool she'd broken the week before, doing it with the focused attention she brought to any task worth doing, and she looked up when he came in and saw what he was carrying and went still. He held it out. She took it. She read it. The whole thing, not just her name, all of it. The legal description of the property and the terms and the county seal and the signatures. Her name was there. Eleanor Hart, co-owner. She handed it back without speaking, Her jaw was tight in the way it got when she was dealing with something she hadn't made space for yet. "You can say something," Wade said. "I don't know what to say." She looked at the tool in her hands. I don't have a speech for this. I'm not asking for a speech." "Good." She set the tool down on the bench and looked at the deed again. "I spent 8 months here trying not to think about what it meant that my name wasn't on anything. Every decision I made, every payment I submitted, every time I had to explain myself to someone at the bank or the feed store." She stopped. "And now it's just on a piece of paper. And that's it." "That's it," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It shouldn't take that much to put a person's name on something they built." "No," he said. "It shouldn't." She nodded once. She picked up the tool and went back to the handle she was fitting. He stood there a moment longer, then went back to the house, because she needed to sit with it in her own way, and he'd learned that about her. She processed the things that mattered privately, and you gave her the room to do it. Later that evening, she came in from the barn and washed up and sat down at the table and said, "I'd like to plant winter wheat on the north field this season. The soil's been resting for 2 years, and I think it's ready." "All right," Wade said. "We'd need to talk to Dillard about the labor." "We can do that." She looked across the table at him, and whatever she'd done with the earlier part of the day had been done. It was integrated now, part of the ongoing practical life of the ranch. "Thank you," she said, "for the deed." "It was yours already," he said. "The paper just made it legible." She looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that holds more than it says, which was how she said most of the things that mattered most to her. "Yes," she said finally. "It did." The valley changed the way things change when a slow pressure is lifted, not all at once, not in any way you could photograph or point to, but cumulatively in 100 small adjustments. Ranchers who had been watching their margins tighten for years found room to breathe. The bank, under new management and the cautious supervision that comes from being under federal scrutiny, began extending credit on terms that were not designed to fail. The Faber spring continued to flow, as it had always flowed, but now there was no hand on an upstream lever waiting for the right moment to close it. Eleanor's name, once it was on the deed and that fact had made its way around the valley in the way facts do, carried a different weight than it had. Not universal respect. There were still people in Alderman's Crossing who had opinions about her that they held on to out of stubbornness or embarrassment about having been wrong, but the kind of functional authority that comes from having been proven right in a way that's impossible to argue with. Agnes Whitfield came to her in April, asking for advice about a grazing lease negotiation. Carl Faber sent his son over twice with questions about cattle management. Thomas Briggs, the council chair, sent a formal letter asking if she would be willing to serve on a subcommittee reviewing water rights documentation for the valley, a request that had its own small irony, which Eleanor noted and then set aside and said yes. She wasn't comfortable with the attention. That was the honest truth of it. She'd spent enough years being invisible that visibility felt like standing in wind, useful information, but uncomfortable. She did what needed doing and declined the things that were ceremony without substance and answered questions when they were real questions and deflected when they weren't. Dillard, who watched all of this without commenting on it, said to Wade one evening when they were in the barn checking on a heifer close to calving, "She gonna stay?" Wade looked up. "She has her name on the deed." "I know she does." Dillard checked the heifer's condition with the practiced deficiency of long experience. "That's not what I asked." Wade understood what he meant. A deed is a legal fact. Staying is a decision made every day, renewed in the small, continuous choices of where you put your effort and what you wake up thinking about. Eleanor had come here with nothing and built something and fought for it and had her name written into it. And she could, at any point, take that name and that record of competence and go build something else somewhere else. She had more options now than she'd had when she arrived, which was the point of all of it. Options meant a real choice, not just an absence of alternatives. "I don't know," Wade said honestly. "I think so, but I don't know." Dillard straightened up. "You should probably find out." He found out on a Sunday in May when the ranch was in the particular productive disorder of spring, calves in the near pasture, The wheat Eleanor had insisted on now green and promising in the north field, repairs happening in 3 places at once because there was finally enough money and time to do them properly. Eleanor was at the fence line at the edge of the home pasture, watching the calves with the focused attention of someone doing a count and a health check simultaneously, and he walked out to stand beside her. They watched the calves for a while without talking. "Are you staying?" he said. She didn't look at him. "Dillard told you to ask." "Dillard suggested I ask. I wanted to." She was quiet for a moment. One of the calves was investigating the fence post with the single-minded curiosity of young animals, pressing its nose against the wood and then startling back from its own boldness. "I spent a long time," Eleanor said, "going places where I wasn't wanted, trying to be useful enough that people would decide they needed me even if they didn't want me." She paused. "It's a bad way to live, being needed but not wanted. I don't recommend it." "Eleanor." "I'm getting to it." She watched the calf. "This is the first place where both things were true. Eventually." She glanced at him sideways. "You didn't want me here at first." "No," he agreed. "I didn't know what you were yet." "And now?" He looked at her, at the worn work gloves, and the jacket that had seen 3 hard winters, and the expression of someone who has never quite learned to want things out loud but hasn't stopped wanting them either. "Now I know exactly what you are," he said, "and I want you here. Not because the ranch needs you, though it does, because I do." She turned her head and looked at him properly. In her face was something she didn't often let be visible, the plain, unguarded expression of a person who has wanted something for a long time and is not yet sure it's safe to stop bracing for it to disappear. "I'm not easy to live with," she said. "I've noticed. I have opinions about everything." "Also noticed. And I'm going to plant 2 more fields in the fall whether you think we're ready or not." "Eleanor." "What?" "I'm not asking you to be different than you are." He held her gaze. "I'm asking if you're staying." She looked back at the pasture. The calf had stopped investigating the fence post and was making its way back to its mother at a pace that suggested it had decided the experiment had been interesting, but the original location was preferable. The morning light was coming in low and yellow across the new grass, the kind of light that makes everything look briefly like a promise. "Yes," she said. "I'm staying." There is something that people don't often say about the kind of life Eleanor Hart built in that valley, because it isn't the part that makes a satisfying story from the outside. The satisfying story is the one about the woman who arrived with nothing and saved a ranch and exposed a fraud and earned her name on a deed. That story is true. It's all true. But the part underneath it, the part that was actually the hardest part, was the 8 months she spent doing necessary work in a place that had not asked for her and did not want her, with no guarantee that any of it would matter. Not knowing if the man whose ranch she was saving would come back and honor what she'd done or resent it, or simply take it over and leave her with nothing to show for the effort. She did the work anyway. Not because she was certain it was worth doing, because it was the work in front of her, and she was capable of doing it, and she had decided that her capabilities were not going to go to waste just because other people had decided they didn't count. That is a harder thing than courage. Courage happens in a moment. What Eleanor did was a sustained daily decision to keep going without knowing the outcome, to keep being exactly what she was in a world that kept telling her it wasn't enough. Most of us know something about that feeling. The work that nobody sees, the competence that goes unrecognized, the place you've built or saved or held together that doesn't have your name on it, may never have your name on it, and you do it anyway because the alternative is to let something worth saving go to ruin. What Eleanor found in the end was not that the world became fair. The world did not become fair. The Dunning family didn't get their land back. The years Whitfield lost couldn't be returned to him. Pettigrew's arrangement meant he never fully answered for what he'd taken from people who trusted him. Kane departed on his own terms, on his own schedule, and likely went somewhere else and became a different version of the same problem. What Eleanor found was something smaller and more durable than fairness. She found a place where her work was visible to the people who mattered. She found a partner who saw what she was and said so out loud. She found a piece of ground with her name written into it, which sounds like a small thing until you understand what it means to have spent your whole life in places where the ground belonged to someone else. And she found, maybe most importantly, that the version of herself she'd been in those 8 months, the one that worked past dark and made hard decisions alone and kept meticulous accounts that no one might ever ask to see, that version of herself was not a temporary emergency measure. It was just who she was. And who she was turned out to be exactly enough. The winter wheat came in well that first fall. Not perfect. There was a week of hard frost in September that took the northeast corner of the field and left it thin. But the rest of it stood solid and gold. And when Eleanor walked the rows in early October with Dillard beside her and Wade following a few steps back, she ran her hand along the top of the grain in a gesture that was not performed for anyone and was not graceful and was not anything except a person touching something they grew out of ground they own. Wade watched her from a few steps behind, and he didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that the moment wasn't already saying. The ranch ran that winter on 2 salaries and a shared ledger and a set of decisions made between 2 people who argued about some of them and agreed on most of them, and occasionally were flatly wrong and had to correct themselves in the spring. Dillard stayed. The north fence got properly repaired. One of the younger calves turned out to have his father's bad temperament, and they dealt with it. Eleanor went to 2 more council meetings that year. She spoke at one of them on the Water Rights Subcommittee recommendations, and Briggs listened and incorporated most of what she said and argued with her about one point for 20 minutes in a way that was, by Alderman's Crossing standards, a form of respect. The valley didn't become a different place. It was still small and still imperfect and still full of people with opinions and grudges and the usual human tendency to learn a lesson only part way and then forget it. The families who had been helped remembered it better than the people who hadn't needed help, which is also how things usually work. But the water ran where it was supposed to run. The spring on the Faber property flowed through an autumn and a winter and a spring without interference, which is a thing that sounds ordinary until you understand that it very nearly didn't. And the Mercer Ranch, which had been 3 weeks from foreclosure when a woman with nowhere else to go decided to stay and do the work, carried 2 names on its deed and ran at a profit by the following spring, and the land was better for having been tended. That is what it looks like when the right person ends up in the right place. Not magic, not a perfect story, not a life suddenly freed from difficulty. It looks like a field that was planted when planting seemed uncertain, coming in imperfectly but well enough, in the October light of a frontier morning, with a woman's hand moving through the grain. There is something that people don't often say about the kind of life Eleanor Hart built in that valley, because it isn't the part that makes a satisfying story from the outside. The satisfying story is the one about the woman who arrived with nothing and saved a ranch and exposed a fraud and earned her name on a deed. That story is true. It's all true. But the part underneath it, the part that was actually the hardest part, was the 8 months she spent doing necessary work in a place that had not asked for her and did not want her, with no guarantee that any of it would matter, not knowing if the man whose ranch she was saving would come back and honor what she'd done, or resent it, or simply take it over and leave her with nothing to show for the effort. She did the work anyway. Not because she was certain it was worth doing, because it was the work in front of her, and she was capable of doing it. And she had decided that her capabilities were not going to go to waste just because other people had decided they didn't count. That is a harder thing than courage. Courage happens in a moment. What Eleanor did was a sustained daily decision to keep going without knowing the outcome, to keep being exactly what she was in a world that kept telling her it wasn't enough. Most of us know something about that feeling. The work that nobody sees, the competence that goes unrecognized, the place you've built or saved or held together that doesn't have your name on it, may never have your name on it, and you do it anyway because the alternative is to let something worth saving go to ruin. What Eleanor found in the end was not that the world became fair. The world did not become fair. The Dunning family didn't get their land back. The years Whitfield lost couldn't be returned to him. Pettigrew's arrangement meant he never fully answered for what he'd taken from people who'd trusted him. Kane departed on his own terms, on his own schedule, and likely went somewhere else and became a different version of the same problem. What Eleanor found was something smaller and more durable than fairness. She found a place where her work was visible to the people who mattered. She found a partner who saw what she was and said so out loud. She found a piece of ground with her name written into it, which sounds like a small thing until you understand what it means to have spent your whole life in places where the ground belonged to someone else. And she found, maybe most importantly, that the version of herself she'd been in those 8 months, the one that worked past dark and made hard decisions alone and kept meticulous accounts that no one might ever ask to see, that version of herself was not a temporary emergency measure. It was just who she was, and who she was turned out to be exactly enough. The winter wheat came in well that first fall. Not perfect. There was a week of hard frost in September that took the northeast corner of the field and left it thin, but the rest of it stood solid and gold. And when Eleanor walked the rows in early October with Dillard beside her and Wade following a few steps back, she ran her hand along the top of the grain in a gesture that was not performed for anyone and was not graceful and was not anything except a person touching something they grew out of ground they own. Wade watched her from a few steps behind, and he didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that the moment wasn't already saying. The ranch ran that winter on 2 salaries and a shared ledger and a set of decisions made between 2 people who argued about some of them and agreed on most of them and occasionally were flatly wrong and had to correct themselves in the spring. Dillard stayed. The north fence got properly repaired. One of the younger calves turned out to have his father's bad temperament, and they dealt with it. Eleanor went to 2 more council meetings that year. She spoke at one of them, on the Water Rights Subcommittee recommendations, and Briggs listened and incorporated most of what she said and argued with her about one point for 20 minutes, in a way that was, by Alderman's Crossing standards, a form of respect. The valley didn't become a different place. It was still small and still imperfect, and still full of people with opinions and grudges and the usual human tendency to learn a lesson only partway and then forget it. The families who had been helped remembered it better than the people who hadn't needed help, which is also how things usually work. But the water ran where it was supposed to run. The spring on the Faber property flowed through an autumn and a winter and a spring without interference, which is a thing that sounds ordinary until you understand that it very nearly didn't. And the Mercer Ranch, which had been 3 weeks from foreclosure when a woman with nowhere else to go decided to stay and do the work, carried 2 names on its deed and ran at a profit by the following spring, and the land was better for having been tended. That is what it looks like when the right person ends up in the right place. Not magic, not a perfect story, not a life suddenly freed from difficulty. It looks like a field that was planted when planting seemed uncertain, coming in imperfectly but well enough in the October light of a frontier morning with a woman's hand moving through the grain.